They thought she was gone for good. They thought the foster kid from Boston had finally learned her place, vanished into the shadows where she belonged. But when those courtroom doors swung open, the silence didn't just break, it shattered. The federal courthouse in Manhattan hadn't felt this heavy, this suffocatingly quiet, since a mob boss took the stand back in 1986. It was a silence that pressed against your eardrums, thick with anticipation. Cameras lined the back wall like predatory eyes, lenses gleaming under the fluorescent hum. U.S. Marshals flanked every exit, hands resting near their belts, scanning the room with practiced indifference. But all eyes were fixed on the defendant's table. There sat Elizio Ferraro. He didn't just occupy the space, he seemed to own the very air around him. And honestly, given the empire he built, he probably did own the building. He was the head of the Ferraro crime family, a man whose net worth exceeded the GDP of most small countries, feared by anyone with enough sense to fear anything. He wore a charcoal three-piece suit that cost more than most people's cars, a silk tie knotted with military precision, and a jaw carved from absolute stone. Beside him sat Katerina Sinclair. She wore a black backless dress that whispered of danger, her red lips curled into a half-smile that promised victory. Her hand was draped over his forearm, casual but possessive, like a trophy claiming its shelf space. They had rehearsed this moment a dozen times in their heads. The divorce was supposed to be uncontested. A formality. His ex-wife hadn't been seen in 10 months. She hadn't answered a single call, hadn't fought back, hadn't made a sound. Everyone knew the story, or at least, the version the tabloids printed. Elizio had married beneath him. Some orphaned foster kid from Boston who spoke 4 languages but never raised her voice. A girl with no family, no money, no power. When he got bored, she disappeared. That's what women like her did. EY faded away. Behind him, his mother, Regina, sat with her back straight as a blade. Her silver hair was pinned tight against her skull, not a strand out of place. She nodded once at the lead attorney. A sharp, decisive motion. Finish this, the attorney nodded back, ready to close the file on Eloise Langston forever. Then, the plaintiff's door opened. It wasn't a dramatic slam. It was a quiet click of the latch. Eloise Langston walked in, and the atmosphere in the room shifted instantly. She wore a faded gray sweater, 2 sizes too big, swallowing her frame. Dark pants, flat shoes worn at the heels. Her brown hair was pulled into a low, messy knot. There was no lawyer at her side. No entourage. No jewelry. Nothing she wore cost more than $20. She looked like she had been surviving on cold coffee and sheer willpower for months. Her skin was pale, her eyes tired, but there was a steeliness in her posture that hadn't been there before. And cradled against her chest, wrapped in a plain white cotton blanket, was a newborn baby. The room detonated. It wasn't an explosion of sound, but of energy. Gasps hit the marble walls and bounced back, multiplying. A reporter in the back row knocked over a chair, scrambling for a better angle, the screech of metal on stone cutting through the air. Katerina's hand froze mid-air, hovering over Elizio's arm. Her smile didn't fade slowly, it shattered, crumbling like dry clay. Regina stood up, then sat back down immediately, her face going white as a sheet. Elizio's lawyers grabbed each other's arms under the table, panic rippling through their expensive suits. The judge hammered his gavel twice, demanding order, but Elizio himself didn't move. He couldn't. His eyes found the baby and stayed there, locked on like a missile target. His chest stopped rising. For a second, he forgot to breathe. Something behind his expression shifted, like a crack splitting through a frozen lake in slow motion. Slow at first, then all at onk. Ellie sat down at the plaintiff's table without a glance in his direction. She didn't look at the cameras. She didn't look at the mother-in-law who hated her. She focused only on the bundle in her arms. The baby whimpered, a tiny, fragile sound. She adjusted the blanket with steady hands, shielding the child from the stares. And Elizio's mind started doing the only kind of math that money can't solve and power can't erase. Timeline math. Biological math. The kind of calculation that rips through every lie a man's ever told himself and leaves him standing in the wreckage with nowhere to hide. That baby was about to change everything. If this story's already got you hooked, hit that like button and share it with someone who deserves a great story. Subscribe now, because what Ellie does next will make Eliseo Ferraro wish he'd never let her walk away. To understand how we got here, we have to go back. 2 years before the night of that courtroom hearing, Eloise Langston was carrying a tray of champagne through the crowd in the grand ballroom of the Plaza Hotel. The charity gala was called the Ferraro Foundation, a name so elegant that no one bothered to ask where the donations actually went. And if anyone ever did ask, they were smart enough not to ask a second time. Crystal chandeliers scattered light across the room, fracturing it into 1,000 diamonds. Men in black suits whispered in corners. Women in floor-length evening gowns glided across the floor like swans. The scent of perfume tangled with expensive liquor, and something else Ellie could not name at the time. Something she would later understand as the smell of power. It smelled like old money and newer secrets. She wore a server's uniform. A crisp white shirt, black trousers, her hair neatly tied back. On her feet were flat shoes with worn soles she had bought at a thrift shop on Atlantic Avenue for $7. She was a ghost in that room, moving among people whose net worth exceeded anything she would earn in a lifetime. And no one looked at her. No one ever looked at her. She was part of the furniture, invisible until she was needed. Until a drunk Italian guest grabbed her wrist and yanked her backward. The tray tipped. The entire array of champagne glasses crashed down onto the suit of the man standing right beside him. Ellie heard glass shatter before she saw it. Golden foam spread across charcoal cashmere like a stain on a masterpiece. She looked up and met Eliseo Ferraro's face for the first time in her life. He didn't shout. He didn't frown. He simply stood there, one hand holding an untouched glass of whiskey, the other hanging loosely at his side. He looked down at her with gray eyes that she would later learn never revealed anything unless he wanted them to. They were cold, assessing, like stone underwater. Ellie panicked so completely that she forgot English. Instinct pulled her toward the language of the man who had grabbed her, and she apologized in Italian. But not just any Italian. It was fluent, precise Florentine Italian. Not the broken kind Americans learned from phone apps, but the dialect of poets and scholars. Eliseo stopped. The whiskey glass froze halfway to his lips. Around him, a bodyguard stepped forward, one seizing the drunk guest, another reaching for a towel to clean the suit. But Eliseo lifted his hand and signaled them all to stop. His eyes never left her. This girl in a server's uniform, in $7 shoes, trembling with fear, had just spoken Italian more cleanly than half the Italian guests in the room. He said nothing to her. He only nodded once, a slight dip of his chin, and turned away as if the matter were finished. But it wasn't finished. Not even close. 20 minutes later, while Ellie was washing her hands in the back kitchen, trying to steady the shaking in her fingers and telling herself she wouldn't be fired, Tommaso Russo was leaning against the doorway, watching her. Tommy, as everyone called him, was all. Eliseo's advisor, his cousin, the man who handled everything Eliseo didn't want to do himself. He wore a gray suit, his smile polite, but his eyes were working. They scanned her from head to toe like a report being read, cataloging every detail. He asked her name. Asked how many languages she spoke. Asked where she lived. His tone was light, conversational. But Ellie knew this wasn't normal conversation because men like him never asked women like her anything unless someone had ordered them to ask. She answered honestly. 4 languages: English, French, Italian, Spanish. She lived in a basement studio in Queens. She worked 3 jobs: freelance translation, bar service, hotel housekeeping. Tommy nodded, filed the information away, and disappeared. 3 days later, a 12-page report lay on Eliseo's desk. Eloise Langston. 25 years old. Mother died of cancer when she was 12. Father, an alcoholic who left when she was 15. 7 foster homes in the Massachusetts system. Physical abuse in the 4th household. She put herself through community college. No criminal record. No debt except student loans. No family. No close friends. No one. Elizio finished reading, closed the file, and for the first time in a very long while, he smiled. It wasn't a warm smile. It was the smile of a man who had just found something he could own without competition. Perfect, he said to Tommy. Just that one word. 1 week after the gala night, Elizio appeared at the bar where Ellie worked the late shift. He didn't call ahead, didn't announce himself. He simply took a seat at the bar at 10 o'clock at night, as if it were the most ordinary thing in the world. A man wearing a suit worth an entire year of her rent, sitting in a modest Hell's Kitchen bar with 2 bodyguards stationed outside the door. He ordered a whiskey neat and waited. Ellie saw him from the far end of the bar and her hand tightened around the tray of glasses. She recognized him instantly because that face, those gray eyes, weren't something you forgot. He didn't call her over, didn't wave. He just sat there drinking his whiskey and waiting until she had to come serve him because it was her job. He asked where she had learned Italian. She said she taught herself from books, from films, from an elderly Italian woman in her 3rd foster home. The only person who had ever been kind to her during those years in foster care. The woman who taught her how to cook pasta and read Dante before Ellie was moved again 4 months later. Elizio listened. He didn't interrupt. Didn't look at his phone. Didn't turn to speak to anyone else. He just listened. And Ellie, a girl used to speaking while no one listened, suddenly found herself saying more than she had planned to a dangerous stranger in a bar near midnight. He came back 3 times over the next 2 weeks. The second time he brought her a book. An original Italian edition of La Divina Commedia, leather-bound, printed in 1947. The kind of book kept behind glass in antiquarian bookstores, not the kind people gave to bar servers. The third time he waited until her shift ended and then said, "Have dinner with me." It wasn't a question. It wasn't exactly an order. It was something in between. And Ellie knew she should say no. But she had said no so few times in her life, and no one had ever listened. So this time she said yes. He took her to an Italian restaurant in the West Village. She had passed it hundreds of times, but never dared to look at the menu taped to the window because she knew one meal there cost a full week of her wages. He ordered in Italian. She ordered in Italian. The waiter looked at her with an expression entirely different from the one she received when she wore a server's uniform. That was the moment Ellie understood something more dangerous than any gun Elizio's world possessed. The feeling of being seen. After that dinner, everything moved faster. He discovered she owned only one winter coat, T.N., the seam at the shoulder torn. Bought at Goodwill 3 years earlier. 2 days later, a package arrived at her basement studio. A gray cashmere coat in a white box with no brand name. But when she put it on, it was lighter than anything she had ever touched and so warm she nearly cried right there on the sidewalk. Not because of the coat, but because for the first time in 25 years of living, someone had noticed that she was cold. She knew who he was. She wasn't stupid. She read the news. She saw the way restaurant staff lowered their heads when he walked in. She saw the 2 bodyguards always standing 10 steps away. She heard Tommy call him boss instead of using his name. She knew Elizio Ferraro was darkness. But when you grow up in darkness your whole life, you don't fear it. You know it. And when that darkness suddenly takes the shape of a man who listens to you and remembers what you like, you tell yourself that maybe this time will be different. This time wasn't different. 3 months after their first meeting, they stood before a judge at Manhattan City Hall. Ellie wore a simple white dress, her hair loose, holding a small bouquet she had bought herself. Elizio wore a black suit. Tommy served as witness. There was no one else. No friends because Ellie had no friends. No family because Ellie had no family. And no Regina Ferraro because she had refused to come. Tommy passed her message to Elizio before the ceremony. Word for word. That girl won't last 6 months, Elizio didn't reply. Ellie never knew about that message. She only knew that when the judge declared them husband and wife and Elizio kissed her, his lips were warm, but his eyes weren't. The penthouse sat on the 42nd floor of a building on the Upper East Side. It was the kind of building whose name didn't appear on maps, and whose entrance bore no sign. Only a doorman who recognized every resident by face and a private elevator that worked only with a key card. The apartment was larger than every place Ellie had ever lived, combined. White marble floors, floor-to-ceiling glass overlooking all of Central Park, a black granite kitchen where no one cooked, a living room with a leather sofa no one sat on, a master bedroom with a king-sized bed where most nights only one person slept. During her first week there, Ellie walked barefoot across the cold stone floor and felt as though she were living inside a museum. Everything beautiful, everything expensive, everything forbidden to touch. In the second week, she discovered the cameras. Not the standard security cameras in hallways that every luxury building had, but cameras inside the apartment itself. Small, mounted in the corners of the living room ceiling, the kitchen, the corridors. Everywhere except the bedroom and the bathroom. She asked Elizio and he answered as if she had asked why the sky was blue. Security. Then returned to reading documents on his desk. In the third week, she learned about the guards. Not the 2 she had seen at restaurants and galas, but 4 rotating in 2 12-hour shifts. 1 always in the ground floor lobby, 1 in the hallway on the 42nd floor, 2 in a black SUV parked outside the building. They didn't follow her inside, but every time she went out, they followed. Grocery shopping, they followed. A walk in the park, they followed. Once she only wanted to sit alone with a coffee at a small cafe on the corner of Madison and she saw the black SUV parked across the street, the driver staring straight through the cafe window. She set her coffee down and lost the desire to drink it. In the second month, Ellie realized she had no money. Not that she lacked spending power. Elizio had given her a secondary credit card tied to his account and told her to buy whatever she needed. But every month, Tommy sent Elizio a detailed statement. And Ellie knew this because she saw the stack of papers on his desk. Every purchase, every location, every hour. A map of her life drawn in transactions. She stopped buying anything that wasn't absolutely necessary. She wanted to ask to work again, at least freelance translation. But Elizio said there was no need. She was his wife. She didn't need to work. His voice was flat as the granite countertop in the kitchen. And she understood this wasn't an invitation, but an order. She tried. She truly tried. She learned to cook Italian dishes from cookbooks she bought with his credit card. She made osso buco and risotto and tiramisu. Set the table for 2 every night with properly folded napkins and candles already lit. Most nights she ate alone. Elizio came home at midnight or 1 in the morning or not at all. And when he did come home, she was already asleep or pretending to sleep because she had learned that if she waited by the door, he looked at her the way one looked at a loyal dog. Half pity, half irritation. She stopped waiting by the 4th month. Some nights he came home and she heard the shower running at 3 in the morning. Once she got up for water and saw his white shirt crumpled in the corner of the bathroom, dark red stains at the wrist and sleeve. At first, she thought it was sauce. Then she realized sauce didn't smell like metal. She didn't ask. By morning, the shirt was gone, and Elizio sat drinking espresso at the kitchen table with clean hands and a new suit, as if the night before hadn't existed. She pretended it hadn't existed, too. That was how they lived, in the most beautiful penthouse Ellie had ever seen. 2 people sharing space, but living apart. One owning the world, and one unable to own even herself. Who could she call? She had no one to call. Friends from the bar had faded away because she wasn't allowed to work anymore. Translation colleagues, too. She had no family. She typed a message to a girl from foster care once and deleted it because she didn't know what to say. That she lived in a multi-million-dollar Manhattan penthouse and was lonelier then. when she was 15, sleeping on the floor of her sixth foster home. Who would believe that? Who would care? She began talking to herself softly, whispering in the bathroom mirror, asking who the face looking back at her belonged to. Because the girl from Boston with 4 languages and iron will was slowly disappearing inside this apartment, losing a small piece every day, and no one noticed, not even her. Katerina Sinclair came for the first time on a Thursday evening. In the 8th month of the marriage, Ellie was lying on the sofa reading when she heard the elevator open and the sound of high heels striking the marble floor in the hallway. Steady, confident. The kind of footsteps belonging to someone who knew exactly where she was going and didn't need an invitation. Ellie sat up. But before she could step into the hall, Tommy appeared at the living room door and said briefly that it was a business meeting. He needed the study and she should turn in early. Tommy didn't meet her eyes when he said it. That was how Ellie knew it wasn't a business meeting. She returned to the sofa and opened her book, but her eyes couldn't follow the words because her ears were listening. Footsteps crossing the hall, the steady door closing, then silence. Then after about 10 minutes, laughter. A woman's laughter. Low, rough, the kind of laugh that wasn't sparked by something funny, but by a desire to let the other person know she was enjoying herself, that she was comfortable, that she was exactly where she wanted to be. Ellie closed the book and set it on the table. She pressed her hands into her thighs. She sat there listening to that laughter seep through the 3-inch thick oak door for the next 2 hours, broken now and then by Alizio's deep voice, the words indistinct, only the tone clear. And she realized he was talking to that woman more than he had spoken to her in the entire past month. Katerina came 3 more times over the following 2 weeks, always in the evening, always after Tommy told Ellie to go to bed early. The 3rd time, Ellie pretended to sleep, but waited in the dark hallway and saw her for the first time when the steady door opened. Tall, straight black hair falling down her back. A pencil skirt, a deep V blouse, eyes sharp as paper cuts, and the smile of someone who knew she was beautiful, and knew that her most powerful weapon wasn't a gun, but the curve beneath expensive fabric. Katerina walked down the hall, and Ellie stood in the shadows less than 10 feet away. But Katerina didn't see her or saw her and didn't bother to look. And both possibilities hurt the same. Alizio followed her to the elevator. And when he turned back, he saw Ellie standing in the hallway, hair loose, eyes wide in the dark, and he stopped for exactly 1 second before continuing toward the study as if she were a piece of furniture he was used to seeing and no longer noticed. That night, Ellie didn't sleep. The next night, neither. On the 3rd night, when Katerina had just left close to midnight, and Alizio was standing in the kitchen pouring whiskey, Ellie stepped out. The kitchen was dark, lit only by city light spilling through the glass, leaving both their faces half bright and half shadowed. And Ellie thought she had never seen light describe their marriage more accurately. "Who is she?" Ellie asked. Her voice calmer than she thought it could be, though her hand was clenched around the edge of the granite counter so hard her knuckles were white. Alizio didn't turn around. He took a sip of whiskey and said that she didn't need to know. "I'm your wife," Ellie said, and she hated the tremor at the end of the sentence. Alizio turned then. He looked at her and in the dim city light, those gray eyes were emptier than any room in the penthouse. "You're my wife because I chose you," he said, his voice level and flat. "And don't confuse that with authority. What do you want, Ellie? Do you want love? Romance? I'm building an empire. I don't have time to be your dream husband." "I never asked for a dream," Ellie said softly. "I only asked for respect." Alizio set the whiskey glass down and stepped toward her. Just 1 step, but close enough for her to smell the alcohol and the perfume that wasn't hers on his collar. And he spoke slowly. "I give you this roof, this protection, this life you, a foster care child abandoned in Boston, never dared to dream of." He paused, letting the sentence hang in the air like a blade, then continued. "If that still isn't enough, then the problem is you, not me." Ellie didn't cry. She wanted to. She wanted to scream that he had just used her deepest wound, the fear of abandonment she had carried for 25 years. The wound she had told him about in those early nights when she still believed he listened because he cared. And he had turned it into a weapon and driven it straight back into her. But she didn't cry. She had cried enough in foster homes where doors closed and left her alone. She had cried enough when her mother lay dying in a hospital bed, and her small hand held the cooling one that never squeezed back. She didn't cry. She looked at Alizio one last time, memorizing that face in the midnight city light, beautiful and cold and empty. Then she turned away, walked into the bedroom, and locked the door. The click of the lock echoed in the silent hall. Ellie leaned her back against the door, slid down to the floor, pulled her knees to her chest, and for the first time in this marriage, she cried, but in absolute silence because she had learned as a child that if people heard her cry, they knew she was weak. And if they knew she was weak, they would use it. Outside the door, Alizio's footsteps paused for 1 second, then moved on. He didn't knock. He didn't ask if she was all right. He poured another glass of whiskey and stood at the window, looking out over the city below. A city he owned a considerable part of. And he didn't think about the woman crying behind the locked door 10 steps away. Or at least that's what he told himself. 3 months after that night of confrontation, Tommy knocked on the penthouse door on a Tuesday afternoon. Ellie opened it and knew immediately that something was wrong. Because Tommy never knocked. He had his own key card. He came and went like a ghost whenever Alizio needed him. And the fact that he knocked meant he wasn't there for Alizio that day. He was there for her. He held a large pale yellow envelope, thick, the kind lawyers used when they wanted your life to change, with a signature on paper. Tommy handed it to her and said he was sorry, then looked down at the floor. It was the first time Tommy had apologized to her since she had stepped into the life of the Ferraro family, and those 3 words told her everything she needed to know before she opened the envelope. Divorce papers. 17 pages. Legal language as cold as the marble floor beneath her feet. Plaintiff, Alizio Ferraro. Grounds, irreconcilable differences. No mention of Caterina. No mention of the nights he didn't come home. No mention of bloodstains on white shirts or a woman's laughter behind the study door. Just 4 clean words, neat and orderly, as if this marriage had died of natural causes instead of being killed. Ellie set the stack of papers down on the kitchen table, the black granite table where she had stood 3 months earlier, and listened to her husband tell her that the problem was her. She looked at Tommy. He was still standing by the door. He said that Mrs. Ferraro would call her. Then he left. The phone rang 15 minutes later. Regina Ferraro's voice on the line was like scissors cutting through fabric. Sharp, precise, not wasting a single syllable. Sign it. Don't make noise. You'll receive $1 million and a non-disclosure agreement. Consider it this family's generosity. Then she paused. The kind of pause Ellie had learned during nearly a year beside this family was the pause that came before a threat. And Regina continued, her voice dropping half a tone. You won't tell anyone anything you saw or heard while living with the Ferraro family. Not the press, not the police, not anyone. And I trust you understand the consequences if you don't keep your word, because this family has a very good memory and a very long reach. A silent line. Ellie held the phone to her ear and listened to her own breathing. Steady, slow, unexpectedly calm, because inside her nothing was calm at all. But she had spent 25 years learning how to hide everything that was breaking inside. She said she understood. 2 words. Then she hung up. She sat down at the kitchen chair and looked at the divorce papers on the table. $1 million. It sounded like a lot, but compared to Alizio Ferraro's hundreds of millions, $1 million wasn't compensation. It was a tip. It was the money you left on the table after a meal so the server would clean up and stay quiet. And Ellie understood clearly and sharply as a blade that she had just been liquidated. Not divorced. Liquidated like a bad investment you cut loose to keep the books clean before the next quarter. Regina had been right from the beginning. That girl wouldn't last 6 months. Ellie had lasted nearly 12. Maybe Regina should have been annoyed at the wrong prediction. But the result was the same. Ellie was still removed and the elevator doors still closed behind her, just like every door that had closed throughout her life. 2 weeks after the divorce papers lay on the kitchen table, Ellie began to vomit. At first, it was in the morning and she thought it was stress, lack of sleep, her body finally surrendering after nearly a year of living under constant tension. Then she vomited in the afternoon, too. Then the smell of espresso that Eliseo drank every morning, a smell she had grown used to over 12 months, suddenly turned her stomach inside out. Then she realized her period was 3 weeks late. She sat on the bed in the bedroom she still locked every night and counted the days in her head again and again. And each time the count came out the same. And each time it did, her heart beat a little faster. She needed a pregnancy test, but she couldn't buy one anywhere near the penthouse because the guards followed her everywhere. And every credit card transaction landed on Tommy's desk at the end of the month. She needed to go out alone. For the first time in nearly a year, she needed to become the ghost she had been before Eliseo Ferraro saw her. She waited until Saturday, the day the guard shift changed at 2 in the afternoon, and there was a gap of about 15 minutes when the old team left, and the new one hadn't taken position yet. She had watched this schedule for months, not because she planned to run, but because when you live in a cage long enough, you unconsciously memorize every weakness in the bars. She put on a hoodie, pulled on a baseball cap, took the stairs down to the basement, slipped out through the maintenance entrance, and stepped onto the Upper East Side sidewalk at 2:07 on a Saturday afternoon like an ordinary woman out for a walk. She took the subway to Queens, got off at Jackson Heights, walked 4 blocks to a small pharmacy wedged between a laundromat and a Vietnamese food restaurant. She bought the pregnancy test with cash. $23 in cash she had hidden in her bra for weeks. $5 and $10 bills she had slowly saved from tips during the rare moments she slipped out for coffee when the guards were careless. The pharmacy bathroom was small, flickering fluorescent light, dirty yellow tile, a loose lock on the door. Ellie sat on the closed toilet lid, held the test, and waited. The longest 3 minutes of her life. Longer than the night her mother died. Longer than the first time she was moved from her 3rd foster home. The only family she had ever loved, sitting in the back seat of a social worker's car with a plastic bag holding everything she owned on her lap. 3 minutes, then 2 lines appeared. Pink, clear, impossible to dim. Why? Ellie stared at those 2 lines and the world stopped. Not the beautiful kind of stop you see in movies with light pouring in and music rising. The kind where the ground disappears beneath your feet and you fall freely without knowing when you will hit bottom. A baby. Eliseo Ferraro's child. The child she had once dreamed of in the early months when she was still naive enough to believe he married her for something other than convenience. When she still cooked dinner for 2 and lit candles and imagined a day when there would be 3 chairs at the table, then 4, then a real family. That dream had died long ago, but the baby was real. And Ellie sat in a pharmacy bathroom in Queens, holding the pregnancy test with hands shaking so badly she nearly dropped it. Her mind racing through every possible outcome. If she told Eliseo, he wouldn't feel joy at becoming a father. He would see an heir. The Ferraro family had been waiting for a successor since Eliseo took power. And a son would be the final brick, completing the empire his father built, and he expanded. They would take the child, not with love, with lawyers, with money, with familiar judges, with midnight phone calls no one ever heard. They would turn the child into another Eliseo, cold, ruthless, taught that power was everything and love was weakness. Or worse. If she tried to keep the baby, they would fight. And who was she? An orphan from foster care. No family, no money, no power, standing against a criminal empire with its own lawyers, its own judges and people willing to do what lawyers and judges couldn't. She would lose. She always lost. But there was a third outcome, the worst one. If Eliseo knew about the baby, the divorce papers would disappear. Not because he wanted her to stay, because he wanted the child to stay, and she would be kept, not as a wife, but as a vessel. The golden cage would never open again. And this time, the change wouldn't be cameras or guards or credit cards, but the chi. LD growing inside her. She would never be free. Ellie sat in that bathroom for 30 minutes. The pregnancy test lay in her palm. The fluorescent light flickered. Outside, Saturday afternoon in Queens was loud with traffic and music and laughter from people passing by. The sounds of freedom she was hearing for the last time before deciding whether to keep it or lose it forever. Ellie left the pharmacy bathroom in Queens that Saturday afternoon and returned to the penthouse before the new guard shift noticed she had gone. She hid the pregnancy test in the pocket of her hoodie, reached the apartment, went into the bathroom, looked at the 2 pink lines once more, then wrapped the test in toilet paper and pushed it to the bottom of the trash under 3 layers of paper towels. She looked at herself in the mirror and told herself, 3 days. Give yourself 3 days to think. She didn't need 3 days. By the second night, lying in the locked bedroom with her hand resting on a belly still flat, she knew no child of hers would grow up in this golden cage. No child of hers would be taught that control was love and silence was duty. No child of hers would become a piece on the Ferraro family chessboard. She would disappear. But disappearing from Elizio Ferraro wasn't like disappearing from an ordinary husband. This was disappearing from a man with networks along the entire East Coast, with watchers in every airport, with Tommy Russo and his team able to find anyone within 48 hours if they wanted to. She needed a plan. She needed time and she needed cash. In the first week, she began withdrawing money, not from the secondary credit card because every transaction was monitored, but through cash back each time she shopped for groceries. $80 of groceries, 20 cash back. The receipt showed 100 in groceries, no questions asked. She did this every time she shopped, 2 to 3 times a week, at different supermarkets along the Upper East Side in Midtown, and each time the $20 was folded and slipped into the lining of an old suitcase she had carried since foster care. The suitcase Elizio had never bothered to look at because it was too cheap to belong in that penthouse. In the second week, she bought a prepaid phone with cash at an electronics shop in Harlem during the 15-minute guard shift gap on Saturday afternoons. She knew by heart. In the third week, she used the prepaid phone to call the National Domestic Violence Hotline. She told the counselor that her husband didn't hit her, but she was completely isolated, financially controlled, monitored in all her movements, implicitly threatened by her husband's family, and that she was pregnant and needed to leave. The counselor was silent for a moment and then said, "Listen to me. Everything you just described is abuse." They connected her to a women's shelter in Brooklyn. And from the shelter, she was referred to the State of Georgia Address Confidentiality Program, a program that allowed survivors of domestic abuse to use a substitute address on all public records. So, the abuser couldn't locate their real residence. Georgia because Savannah. She didn't choose Savannah by accident. She researched for 3 consecutive nights on the prepaid phone under the covers, the screen light washing her face in the bedroom dark. She needed a city far enough from New York, small enough to be affordable, large enough to be anonymous, with community clinics that accepted uninsured patients, with internet fast enough for her to teach languages online. Savannah met everything. Warm year-round, near the sea. No one there knew the name Ferraro. It took her 4 weeks to prepare. 4 weeks living in the penthouse with the unsigned divorce papers still on the kitchen table. With Elizio coming and going like a ghost at midnight. With Katerina arriving every Thursday and that laughter still seeping through the study door. With her lower abdomen beginning to firm slightly hidden beneath oversized hoodies because in that penthouse no one looked closely enough to notice. She waited for the right moment. The moment came on a Friday night when Elizio told Tommy he wouldn't be home for the weekend. She knew where he was. The entire penthouse knew where he was. No one said it out loud. At 3 in the morning on Saturday, Ellie woke. No alarm because she hadn't slept. She put on jeans, a hoodie, flats, and left the cashmere coat he bought her hanging on the rack. She carried 2 things. The old foster care suitcase holding clothes, documents from the Address Confidentiality Program, the prepaid phone, and $760 in cash. and a small shoulder bag with her passport and the pregnancy test she had carefully wrapped and kept for reasons she didn't fully understand. Perhaps because it was the only proof the baby was real. She stepped into the kitchen one last time. She placed her wedding ring on the black granite counter exactly in the center, directly under the ceiling light. The 3-carat diamond ring lay there, small, glittering, alone on the white surface, and Ellie thought she had never seen something so expensive look so worthless. She didn't write a note. She didn't leave a message. The ring was everything she wanted to say. And if he didn't understand, it didn't matter anymore. She took the stairs to the basement, out through the maintenance entrance, onto the sidewalk at 3:20 in the morning. The street was empty. March wind cut through her hoodie. She walked 4 blocks to the Greyhound bus station at 34th Street and 11th Avenue. She bought a ticket with cash. New York to Savannah, Georgia. 14 hours. Hard seats, flickering neon lights, the smell of diesel and old plastic upholstery. She took a window seat. The bus pulled out at 4:15 in the morning. And as it passed through the Lincoln Tunnel and emerged on the far side of the Hudson River, Ellie turned to look back at the Manhattan skyline. Through the rear window. The skyscrapers blazed in the night, one of them holding the penthouse where a wedding ring lay alone on a kitchen table. And as the city shrank to a thin glowing outline and then disappeared entirely into the dark, Ellie placed a hand on her belly. And for the first time in nearly a year, she let herself exhale fully. Exhaling the penthouse and the cameras and the guards and Katerina's laughter and Elizio's cold gray eyes and Regina's threat and the divorce papers and the metallic smell of blood on a shirt at 3 in the morning. She breathed it all out until her lungs were empty. And then she breathed in slow and deep, and the new air tasted of night highway and diesel and freedom. The Greyhound bus arrived in Savannah at 6 in the evening the next day. And when Ellie stepped off the platform with her old suitcase and shoulder bag, warm air pressed against her face like a soft hand. Savannah was unlike anywhere she had ever lived. Not like Boston, frozen with narrow streets and foster care memories sealed at every corner. Not like Manhattan with its steel and glass and marble and cold gray eyes. Savannah had ancient oak trees draped with Spanish moss like silver hair, small squares scattered through the city center, the salty breath of the sea woven into the afternoon breeze, and golden sunlight slipping through leaves to cast dappled shadows on red brick sidewalks. She found an apartment on her 3rd day in Savannah. A 2nd-floor unit in an old building on Bull Street near Forsyth Park. 1 bedroom, a small kitchen, a bathroom with a hot shower that lasted about 10 minutes before turning cold, windows facing the neighbor's roof, and if she tilted her head just right, she could see a slice of blue sky above the oak at the end of the street. The landlord was an old man named Gus, sun-brown skin, straw hat, who asked her exactly 2 questions. Her name and how she would pay. She said, Eleanor, and said, cash. He nodded, handed he. Are the keys, and asked nothing more. Rent was $450 a month. With the $760 she had left, she had just enough for the first month and the deposit. She needed work immediately. On the 4th day, she registered on 3 online language teaching platforms. Teaching French and Italian to students in Europe and Asia, using the name Eleanor Grant, relying on free internet at the Savannah Public Library until she could afford her own connection. Income was uneven. Some weeks $200, some weeks only $80. But she lived on ramen and rice and canned beans. And she had lived with less her whole life, so this wasn't hardship. This was normal. In her 2nd week in Savannah, she went to the Community Health Clinic on Habersham Street, a federally funded clinic for uninsured patients. Sliding scale fees, cash accepted, no identification required beyond a name and date of birth. The obstetrician was Dr. Ruth Calloway, a woman in her 60s with silver hair pinned up, round-framed glasses, small, steady hands, and a Georgia drawl that moved as slowly as honey poured from a spoon. She performed the ultrasound. And when the flickering black and white image appeared on the screen and the heartbeat filled the small exam room, fast, steady, alive, Ellie gripped the edge of the exam table until her fingers went white. Dr. Calloway steadied her for a moment and asked gently whether she had family, whether she had anyone with her. Ellie said they were overseas and that she would be fine. The doctor nodded and didn't press, but from that visit on, she always stayed 10 minutes longer, asking what Ellie ate, how she slept, whether she needed referrals or support. And Ellie understood that Dr. Calloway didn't believe she was fine, but was wise enough not to force the truth. Ellie wasn't fine. She cried every night in the small apartment on Bull Street, lying on a single bed, bought from a Goodwill for $40. Thin blanket, worn pie. Low, listening to crickets outside the window, and jazz drifting from the bar on the corner, crying because her loneliness ached down to the bone. Her body changed, her belly grew, her back hurt, her ankles swelled. She craved cheese and pickles and hot chicken soup she couldn't afford because that week she had earned only $90. In week 16, lying in bed near midnight, she felt it. Not pain, not contractions, something lighter, softer, like a butterfly brushing the inside of her belly. The baby kicked for the first time. Ellie held her breath, pressed her hand to her stomach, and waited. It kicked again, stronger, real. She wanted to tell someone. She wanted to shake a shoulder beside her and say she felt it. The baby kicked, but there was no one beside her. No one to call at midnight. No one to share what should have been the most beautiful moment of a mother's life. She lay there with her hand on her belly, eyes fixed on the ceiling, tears sliding back into her hair, and she whispered to the baby that it was just the two of them, but that was enough. She promised it was enough. In week 28, everything nearly ended. She was teaching an online French class at 3 in the afternoon when her vision blurred. A brutal headache bloomed at the back of her skull and her hands swelled until she couldn't type. She shut the laptop, called a taxi, and went to the emergency room at Memorial Health Savannah. Her blood pressure read 160/105. Preeclampsia. They put her on a bed, attached monitors, ran magnesium sulfate into her veins, and for the next 3 hours, Ellie lay alone, listening to the steady beep of the monitor, and the sound of her baby's heartbeat through a small speaker strapped to her abdomen, gripping the bed rails with both hands until metal bit into her palms, telling the child inside her in a trembling but unbroken voice that she wouldn't lose them, that she wouldn't let anyone take them, that I had to stay with her. The attending physician asked if there was anyone she needed to call. She shook her head. The doctor looked at her alone, nearly 7 months pregnant. No visitors, no calls, and Ellie saw in the doctor's eyes the thing she hated most in the world. Pity. Her blood pressure stabilized after 6 hours. They kept her overnight for observation. She lay in the hospital room, hallway light seeping through the door, nurses' footsteps passing back and forth, and she didn't sleep. She rested her hand on her belly and felt the baby move gently as if saying they were still there. And Ellie closed her eyes but didn't sleep. Just lay there holding her child with her hands and her will and a promise that even if the world turned its back, she never would. 9 weeks after that night in the emergency room on a Tuesday evening in week 37, Ellie was sitting on the bed grading assignments for her Italian students when the first pain arrived. It wasn't the dull backache she had grown used to over the past 3 months. This was different, deeper, lower. As if someone had grabbed her entire lower body and twisted. She stopped, set the laptop aside, breathed slowly, and told herself it was a Braxton Hicks contraction, the false kind Dr. Calloway had warned her about. But 15 minutes later, it came back stronger. Then 12 minutes after that, then 9. And when Ellie stood up from the bed, she felt warm liquid running down her legs and looked at the old wooden floor of the Bull Street apartment and understood that this wasn't practice. This was real, and the baby was coming 3 weeks early. She called a taxi on the prepaid phone, her hands shaking so badly, she dialed the wrong number twice. She shoved her wallet into her bag, grabbed the small hospital bag she had packed since week 35 on Dr. Calloway's advice. Inside newborn clothes, diapers, a white cotton blanket she bought at Walmart for $12, and the documents from the address confidentiality PR. Agrim. She locked the apartment door, gripped the railing down the stairs, and every step brought a new wave of pain, and she bit her lip until she tasted blood. The taxi arrived after 11 minutes. 11 minutes standing on the Bull Street sidewalk at 10 at night, alone, pregnant, contractions 7 minutes apart, leaning against the lamp post and breathing the way Dr. Calloway had taught her. In for 4, out for 6. Except Dr. Calloway taught it in a brightly lit clinic with a comfortable chair, not on a dark sidewalk that smelled of damp oak trees while jazz still drifted from the corner bar, as if the world didn't know she was standing there alone, about to give birth. The taxi drove her to Memorial Health in 12 minutes. She crossed the emergency room doors at 10:33 at night, her cervix already 5 centimeters dilated, and the nurses rushed her straight to labor and delivery. The delivery room was flooded with white light, monitors, a steel bed, the smell of antiseptic. A nurse asked if anyone was with her, if there was anyone they should call. She shook her head. They exchanged a look. She saw it. She didn't care. She cared only about the next contraction rising like a wave as she gripped the bed rail and pushed when the doctor told her to push and screamed when her body told her to scream. There was no hand holding hers, no voice whispering that she was doing great, that she should keep going, that someone was there. Only her and a team of strangers and the steady beeping of monitors and blinding white light. She pushed, she screamed, she pushed, she thought she would die. She thought her body would split in two. Then the doctor said they could see the baby's head. One more push. And Ellie gathered everything she had left inside her. Everything. 7 foster homes and a dead mother and a father who left and a cold penthouse and empty gray eyes and a wedding ring lying alone on a kitchen counter and $760 in cash and a 4T. An hour Greyhound ride and a Queen's Pharmacy bathroom and 2 pink lines. She gathered it all into one final push and she screamed. Not a scream of pain, but a scream of 27 years. And the baby was born. 5:17 in the morning. Dawn was rising over Savannah outside the hospital window. The sky shifting from black to purple to pink. And in the delivery room, there was crying. Not Ellie's. The baby's. A boy, small, red, wrinkled, perfect. The doctor placed him on Ellie's chest, still wet, still crying, heavier than she expected, and lighter than anything she had ever held. She looked down. His nose, Elysio's nose, straight and sharp. Even seconds after birth, she recognized it. His eyes, her eyes, brown, wide, still closed, but she knew. She felt it. He stopped crying when his skin touched hers. He lay on her chest, listening to her heartbeat. The heartbeat that had carried him for 9 months, and he grew quiet. Ellie wrapped both arms around her son, and something shattered inside her. Not the kind of breaking that hurts. The kind where the last door is blown open and light floods the darkest place. Not love. Love was too small a word, too soft, too often used by people who didn't know how heavy it truly was. This was purpose. This was the ferocity of protective instinct she had never known she possessed. Something no foster home taught her. No book described correctly. Something she only understood with a baby weighing under 7 pounds on her chest. And the certainty that she would burn the world down if the world dared touch her child. The nurse asked what the baby's name was. Ellie looked at her son. He opened his eyes for the first time. Just a narrow slit, seeing nothing clearly, yet looking straight toward her as if he knew. Nico, she whispered. Victory of the people. Everything she hoped he would become. A victor without belonging to darkness. Strong without being cold. Her son, but no one's pawn. Nico, her son. The dawn climbed higher. Savannah's son. Light poured through the delivery room window, warm and golden, falling over mother and child. Ellie held Nico, and for the first time in 27 years, she wasn't alone. The first 3 months of motherhood taught Ellie that exhaustion wasn't a state. It was a way of life. Nico never slept more than 2 hours at a time. She nursed him at midnight, at 2, at 4, at 6. Then the day began and she made coffee with one hand while holding him with the other. And the coffee was always cold before she finished it because he cried again or needed a diaper change or needed to be burped or needed to be walked back and forth through the small Bull Street apartment until he fell asleep on her shoulder only to wake the moment she laid him down as if sleep were a game he refused to play by the rules. She taught French online while he slept, typing as softly as possible, holding her breath whenever he stirred. She washed clothes by hand in the kitchen sink because there was no washer. She boiled water for formula supplements at 3 in the morning with eyes only half open. She lived on 2 hours of sleep, cold coffee, instant noodles, and something she could only call pure instinct. The thing that wouldn't let her collapse because there was a 7-pound life entirely dependent on her, and she wasn't allowed to fall. But she was stronger than before. Stronger than she had been in the penthouse. Stronger than when she listened to Katerina's laughter behind the steady door. Stronger than when she sat on the floor of a Queen's Pharmacy bathroom, staring at 2 pink lines. Every morning she looked at Nico and knew she was doing the right thing. But every night when he slept and the apartment fell silent, fear returned. The Ferraro family had people everywhere. Tommy Russo had once bragged that Elysio's network stretched along the East Coast from Boston to Miami. That no one had ever tried to disappear from Elisio Ferraro and succeeded for long. Back then, Ellie thought Tom. Why was boasting? Now she thought he had been warning her. Savannah wasn't far enough. No place was far enough. One day, someone would recognize her face, or a system would update, or records would be cross-checked, or Elisio would simply decide to look for her. And when he decided to look, he would find her. And when he came, he wouldn't come alone, but with lawyers, with money, with quiet power, with everything she didn't have, and he would take Nico. Ellie lay staring at the ceiling at 2 in the morning, listening to her son's steady breathing in the old crib she bought from a thrift store beside the bed. And she understood that running had an expiration date. She couldn't run forever, but she could choose how to stop. She could choose to walk into a courtroom on her terms instead of being dragged there on his. The truth was the only weapon she had, and she needed to use it before he found her. 2 weeks before the divorce hearing date, Ellie took the prepaid phone and called Charles Whitfield. She had found his name 6 months earlier through a free legal hotline at the women's shelter. A Manhattan civil attorney specializing in divorces involving abuse and coercive control. 55 years old, salt and pepper hair, known for taking pro bono cases no one else dared touch. He answered and was silent for 10 seconds when she said her name. Eloise Langston. Miss Langston, where are you? I've been looking for you for 5 months. Mr. Park's team, Mr. Ferraro's, has been threatening sanctions because you haven't appeared. I'll be there, she said, her voice so calm it surprised her. I need you to file a separate emergency petition for temporary custody along with the divorce. Custody. He repeated, his tone shifting. Miss Langston, do you have a child? I have a son, 3 months old. Elisio Ferraro's. Silence on the line. She heard him take one deep breath and the creak of a chair. Miss Langston, he said slowly. You understand that when you walk into that courtroom with a baby, everything changes. You understand that? I do, Ellie said. That's why I'm calling you. I'm not calling to hide anymore. I'm calling because I'm going to walk into that room and tell the truth, and I'm not going to let them take my son. Will you help me? Charles Whitfield was silent for 3 more seconds, then said he would meet her in court and told her to bring everything she had, every document, every piece of evidence, everything. And Miss Langston, he paused. You're very brave. Ellie ended the call, looked over at Nico sleeping in his crib, and whispered that they were going back to New York, her son. And this time, she wasn't running anymore. The judge struck the gavel for the 3rd time, and the courtroom fell quiet enough to hear pages turning on a lawyer's table. Elisio's lead attorney rose first. Victor Hargrove, senior partner at one of New York's top 5 law firms, wearing a dark gray suit worth 3 months of Ellie's rent in Savannah, his voice deep and steady like a man who had won hundreds of cases, and had no reason to believe this one would be different. He argued that Eloise Langston had willfully absconded from her place of residence for 10 months, failed to notify the court, failed to respond to any communication from his client, failed to comply with legal procedure, and that such behavior demonstrated mental and emotional instability. That a woman who fled without explanation couldn't be considered capable of making decisions for herself, let alone for an infant. He used the word fled 4 times. He used the word unstable 3 times. He didn't once mention why she left. When Hargrove sat down, Charles Whitfield stood. He wasn't wearing an expensive suit, white shirt with rolled sleeves, dark blue tie, salt and pepper hair, slightly disheveled from a night spent preparing files. He opened with a single sentence. "Your Honor, my client didn't flee. She escaped." Then he opened his case. Exhibit on. E. A report from the Brooklyn Women's Shelter documenting that Eloise Langston contacted the National Domestic Violence Hotline and was assessed as a survivor of psychological abuse and systematic coercive control. Exhibit 2. Records from the State of Georgia Address Confidentiality Program confirming she qualified for protected status as a domestic abuse survivor. Exhibit 3. A sworn affidavit from Eloise Langston detailing complete social isolation, financial control through a secondary credit card system with all transactions monitored, in-home surveillance cameras and 24-hour external security, and implicit threats from her husband's family upon receipt of divorce papers. Exhibit 4. The birth certificate of baby Nico, born at Memorial Health Savannah. Mother Eloise Langston, father unacknowledged. Charles placed each document on the judge's bench. Each one a brick in a wall Elisio's legal team hadn't prepared to face because they came ready for a default judgment, not a fight. Hargrove objected, saying the allegations hadn't been independently verified, that Mr. Ferraro had never been convicted of abuse, that security systems were protective, not controlling. The judge looked at Hargrove and said she would review the matter, then turned to Ellie. "Miss Langston, do you wish to address the court?" Ellie stood. Nico slept in her arms, eyes closed, unaware that his mother was standing in a courtroom facing the most powerful man on the American East Coast. She didn't look at Elisio. She looked at the judge. Her voice wasn't loud, but it was steady, the voice of someone who had cried every tear and had nothing left to lose but the child in her arms. "Your Honor, I don't want Mr. Ferraro's money. I don't want the penthouse. I don't want assets or compensation. I'm not here for revenge. I'm here for my son. I'm asking for full custody. If Elisio Ferraro wants to be a father, he has to prove he can be one. Not with money, not with lawyers, not with with actions, with real change, with evidence that he can put a child's needs above his own need for control. Until he proves that, my son stays with me." The courtroom was silent. Not the fearful silence from when she entered. A different silence. The kind that followed 200 people watching a foster care orphan with no money, no power, no backing, look straight at the Ferraro empire and say no. Nico made a small sound in his sleep. Ellie lowered her voice, gently patted his back and sat down. And then Elisio spoke. Not through his attorney, not through Tommy. Himself. His voice low, almost a whisper, but the room was so quiet that even a whisper rang like a shout. "Is that my son?" 3 words. Not an order, not a demand. A question. And in that question was something Ellie had never heard in Elisio Ferraro's voice during the entire year she lived with him. Something trembling, something cracked, something like a man realizing he had lost something he never knew he had. Ellie looked at him for the first time since entering the courtroom. Those gray eyes, once cold as steel and empty as the penthouse, now held something else. A fracture. Small but real. She didn't answer. She didn't need to. The baby had his nose and the entire courtroom could see it. The judge reviewed the evidence, consulted with both legal teams, and 20 minutes later issued a temporary ruling. Temporary custody was granted to Eloise Langston. Elisio Ferraro was granted supervised visitation contingent upon participation in psychological counseling and proof of a safe environment for the child. A full hearing was scheduled for 3 months later to assess progress. When the gavel struck to adjourn, Ellie held Nico tight against her chest and exhaled. She hadn't won. Not yet. But she hadn't lost. And for her today, that was enough. If you're still here with this story, then you're already part of our family. Tap like and tell us what you think will happen next in the comments. Don't forget to subscribe because what happens after this hearing is where everything truly begins. Ellie stepped into the courthouse hallway with Nico in her arms and Charles Whitfield walking beside her saying something about next week's schedule and additional filings. But she didn't hear him clearly because her ears were still ringing with the sound of her own heartbeat, still faster than normal since the moment she stood and spoke before the court. The hallway was long, stone-floored, lit by fluorescent lights. Reporters held back beyond the security doors, their noise still rolling in like distant surf. She heard footsteps behind her before Charles could turn. Fast, heavy, decisive footsteps. The kind belonging to someone unaccustomed to being told no and unaccustomed to anyone walking ahead of him. Eloise. Alizio's voice cut through the hallway, and she stopped. Not because he called her name, but because her body reacted. Nearly a year under this man's roof had etched into her instincts the habit of stopping when he spoke. She hated that. She turned. Alizio stood 5 steps away. Tommy behind him, keeping distance. 2 bodyguards farther back along the corridor. Katerina was nowhere in sight. Perhaps she had left through another exit. Or perhaps she was wise enough to know this wasn't the moment to stand beside him. Charles stepped forward, angling himself slightly in front of Ellie like a shield, but Ellie placed a hand on his arm and shook her head once. She looked at Alizio. He looked at her, then his gaze dropped to the baby in her arms and stayed there. And she saw his jaw tighten, then loosen, then tighten again like a man trying to swallow something too large for his throat. "You hid my son," he said, his voice low and controlled. But beneath that control, something was cracking, and they both knew it. "You hid my son for 10 months. You gave birth alone and never told me." Ellie looked at him and she was afraid. Afraid enough that her knees want to give way. But she had given way enough in her life. And she would not do it again in front of this man. Not now. Not with her child in her arms. She spoke calmly, each word precise. "I know exactly what you can do. I know you have lawyers you can buy, judges you can call, people willing to do what lawyers and judges won't. I know your family has a long memory and a long reach. Your mother made that very clear to me on the phone. I know everything you could do to me if I stayed. That's why I ran." Alizio stood there and said nothing. Not the silence he chose. Not the powerful silence he wielded in boardrooms and penthouses and every room he entered. This was the silence of a man who couldn't find words because for the first time in his life, someone was looking him straight in the face and telling him the truth without lowering her eyes, without shaking, without pleading. Simply stating why she feared him, and leaving that truth standing in the courthouse hallway like a mirror he couldn't turn away from. Tommy stared at the floor. Charles held his position, his eyes on Alizio with the weary focus of someone who knew he was standing close to a predator. Nico stirred in Ellie's arms and made a small sound, and in the quiet hallway, it rang louder than anything spoken before. Alizio looked at the baby, looked at Ellie, then looked at the baby again. He opened his mouth as if to say more, but nothing came. He turned away, walked off. Tommy followed. The bodyguards followed Tommy. Footsteps receded along the stone floor until only echoes remained, then nothing. Ellie stood there holding Nico, and her legs began to shake violently. She had held herself together long enough, and now her body demanded payment. Charles placed a hand on her shoulder and asked softly if she was all right. She nodded even though she wasn't. She would be, but not yet. Right now, she only needed to leave this building and breathe air that didn't smell of expensive perfume and power and lie. Alizio returned to the penthouse at 8 that night after the hearing, not saying a word in the car from the courthouse to home. Tommy in the front passenger seat knowing better than to speak. The driver knowing better than to glance at the rearview mirror. The private elevator rose to the 42nd floor. The doors opened and Alizio stepped into an empty apartment. Empty not because anything was missing. Everything was still there. The leather sofa, the marble floors, the glass walls overlooking Central Park, the ceiling lights switching on automatically when the sensors detected movement. Empty because it had been empty since the morning Ellie left 10 months earlier, and he had known that, but had never admitted it until tonight when he crossed the kitchen and saw the wedding ring. It was still there, centered on the black granite countertop, exactly where she had placed it 10 months earlier at 3 in the morning before walking out the service entrance in the basement and disappearing. The 3-carat diamond caught the ceiling light and glittered, small and solitary on the wide surface, and Elizio realized he had never put it away. The penthouse was cleaned weekly. The housekeeper came 3 times a week. No one had touched the ring, not because he had ordered it left there, but because no one dared ask what he wanted done with it, and he never mentioned it. And if no one mentioned it, it didn't exist. But it existed. It had sat there for 8 months like a silent indictment. He stepped past every day without looking down or looking down and pretending not to see. He poured whiskey, drank it in one swallow, poured another. Tommy entered the kitchen, leaned back against the opposite wall, arms crossed, and looked at Elizio with an expression he had never used on his boss. Not fear, not submission, just blunt honesty. She lived 6 months on cash, Tommy said evenly. Under an assumed name. Slipped past our security system without a single camera see. Atching her. She gave birth alone in a hospital in Georgia. No hand to hold, no one beside her, nearly died of preeclampsia at week 28. She raised the baby for 3 months on online teaching money and instant noodles. Then she walked into that courtroom on her own and faced you and your entire legal team without shaking for a second. Tommy paused. She isn't weak, Elizio. She's stronger than you thought. Stronger than anyone I've ever seen. The whiskey glass left Elizio's hand before he realized he had thrown it. It struck the marble wall above the sink and exploded. Shards scattering across the floor. Whiskey streaking down the white stone. Tommy didn't move. He had seen Elizio furious before. Had seen him slam tables, smash phones, break whatever was within reach when a deal collapsed or someone betrayed him. But Tommy knew tonight was different. Tonight, Elizio wasn't angry at someone else. He was angry at himself. And that was a kind of anger Tommy had never seen in his boss. Because Elizio Ferraro never turned the blade inward. Not until now. Elizio stood in the middle of the kitchen, his arms still lifted from the throw, breathing hard, eyes fixed on the shattered glass on the floor, but not really seeing it. He saw the dark hallway in this penthouse 9 months earlier. A Thursday night, Katerina just gone. Him walking her to the elevator and turning back to find Ellie standing in the shadows of the hall, her hair loose, her eyes wide. And he had known she was there. He had known she had heard. He had known she had seen Katerina. And he had walked past her as if she were a ghost. Because to him, then she was a ghost, an object. The wedding ring on the kitchen counter he saw every day but no longer valued. He remembered her eyes that night, brown, wide, not angry, not crying, just looking at him with something worse than anger or tears. Looking at him with understanding, with acceptance that she held no value in his eyes. And she had been right because he had walked past without stopping. Elizio lowered his arm, looked at the ring on the counter, looked at the glass on the floor, looked at Tommy, still leaning against the wall, silent, waiting. He said hoarsely, "I have a son." "Yes," Tommy said. "And she didn't tell me because she was afraid of me." "Yes." "Because she had reason to be afraid." Tommy didn't answer that last line. He didn't need to. The silence was answer enough. Elizio turned to the glass wall, the city blazing below with millions of lights. And somewhere in that city or beyond it, Ellie was holding his son, the child he hadn't known existed until this morning. Holding him alone the way she had done everything alone since the day he decided she wasn't worth stopping for. Katerina arrived at the penthouse the next morning uninvited. She had her own key card because Elizio had given it to her 4 months earlier when Ellie still lived there. A detail he had never reconsidered until now when she stepped out of the elevator at 9 in the morning wearing a white blazer and black trousers, hair sleek, lips red, carrying 2 cups of coffee from the cafe downstairs, as if this were an ordinary morning, and yesterday's hearing had been nothing more than a minor inconvenience to be managed. She set the coffee on the kitchen counter less than a hand's width from Ellie's wedding ring without so much as glancing at it, and said she had spoken with Hargrove that morning, that he believed the temporary ruling could be appealed, though it would take time, but she knew Judge Morrison in the Brooklyn family court, that he owed Polly Graziano a favor from last year. And if Elizio wanted, she could arrange for the case to be reassigned to Morrison's courtroom, and the outcome would be completely different. The woman would lose custody within 2 weeks. She spoke about his son, about his son's mother, about buying a judge to take a child away from the woman who had carried him alone and kept him alive. And she did it in the same tone, one used to discuss a corporate merger strategy, emotionless, purely calculated. Elizio looked at Caterina standing in his penthouse kitchen with her coffee and her plan to purchase a judge and her confident smile and knife-sharp eyes. And for the first time, he truly saw her. Not a lover, not an ally. A parasite. She clung to his power the way moss clings to stone. She did not love him. She loved the name Ferraro and everything that name unlocked. And if he lost everything tomorrow, she would be at the side of the next powerful man before he finished setting his glass down. Exactly the way he had used Ellie. Took her because she was convenient. Kept her because she was easy to control. Discarded her when she no longer served a purpose. He and Caterina were not lovers. They were 2 parasites who had happened to find each other. "Get out," Elizio said. Caterina stopped mid-sentence. She looked at him, waiting for more, waiting for context. Waiting for explanation because she was a lawyer and lawyers required context. He gave her none. "Get out. We are done. Leave the keycard on the table." Caterina set the coffee down slowly, deliberately, though her fingers tightened around the cup more than necessary. He added before she could speak that she should not think about using any information she had about his business. That she knew better than anyone what happened to people who threatened the Ferraro family. His voice did not rise or fall. It was flat. It was the most dangerous tone Elizio Ferraro possessed. And Caterina was smart enough to recognize it. She placed the keycard beside the coffee, picked up her bag, stepped into the elevator, and when the doors closed, Elizio saw her hand shaking. He felt nothing. No regret, no longing, no sense of loss. She was a chapter he had closed. That afternoon, he drove to Regina's house on Long Island. The 3-story Greystone estate sat on 2 acres, the place where he had grown up, where his father once sat at the dinner table and taught him that Ferraro men did not apologize, did not explain, did not show weakness. Regina received him in the living room. Tea already poured into 2 cups. She always knew before he arrived. Her network required no cameras or guards, only the ability to read her son. That baby, Regina began flawed. TLY. That foster care girl is using him to play games. The baby is a pawn. If he were a pawn, she would have used him to demand money, Elizio said. She stood in front of the judge and said she did not want a single dollar. She did not want the penthouse. She only wanted her child. You call that a pawn? Regina set her teacup down. She looked at her son, and in her eyes was something Elizio had never seen before. Not anger, not disappointment. Almost surprise, because her son had never spoken back to her. Not once. Since his father died, she had made the final decisions in this family, and Elizio had carried them out. That was the order. That was how the Ferraros operated until now. You want a grandson? Elizio said calmly, his gaze fixed on hers without wavering. You want an heir? I have an heir. But if you want to know your grandson, you will have to earn it just like I will. You will not buy judges. You will not threaten Ellie. You will not call her and remind her of consequences. If you want to be in Nico's life, you will walk through the front door like a normal person and prove you deserve it, just like I will have to prove it. Regina stared at her son. 15 seconds of silence stretched longer than any negotiation Elizio had ever been part of. Then she said he had changed a great deal in a single night. No, Alizio said. I should have changed long ago. He set the untouched teacup down, stood, and left the Long Island estate without looking back. On the drive back to Manhattan, Tommy caught his reflection in the rearview mirror, and for the first time in 12 years, working with Alizio Ferraro, Tommy did not know who the man in the back seat was, but he thought maybe that was a good thing. Dr. Philip Ward's office was on the 6th floor of a building on 68th Street and Park Avenue, 9 blocks from Alizio's penthouse, close enough to walk, but Alizio still drove out of habit, and because Ferraro men did not walk city streets like ordinary people. The office was smaller than he expected. He had imagined expensive leather sofas, abstract art on the walls, and spa-like lighting. But instead, there were 2 gray fabric armchairs facing each other, a small table with a box of tissues, a window looking out at rooftops, and a water tank on the neighboring building. And Dr. Ward himself, a man in his early 60s with closely cut gray hair, black framed glasses, and a light blue shirt without a tie, sitting with a notebook he never opened the entire session. Alizio sat in the opposite chair at 10 on a Monday morning, the first appointment ordered by the court, and said nothing. 5 minutes, 10 minutes, 15 minutes. Dr. Ward said nothing either. He sat there with one leg crossed, hands resting on his knees, looking at Alizio with the calm gaze of a man who had spent 30 years facing every kind of human being, and had never been frightened by any of them, not even the Mafia boss now sitting in front of him. 16 minutes. Alizio said, "Aren't you going to ask me anything?" Dr. Ward replied, "I don't need to ask. You'll speak when you're ready." 17 minutes. Alizio said, "I don't believe in this, Doctor." Ward nodded and said, "Most people who sit in that chair say the same thing. Usually because they're trying to delay saying the thing they're actually afraid to say." Silence. 20 minutes. Alizio looked out the window. Then he said, "My father died when I was 25, and it was the first time he had ever spoken about his father to anyone outside the language of business, power, or inheritance. My father taught me that Ferraro men are not weak, that emotions are a luxury leaders can't afford, that women are either allies or burdens with no gray space in between, that control is protection, and that anyone who resists control is a traitor." He stopped. Dr. Ward did not write anything. He simply listened. "How did your father teach you these things?" he asked. "By exam." "PLE," Alizio said, his voice flat while his hands clenched around the arms of the chair. "My mother never left the house without an escort. My mother didn't have her own account until my father died. My mother never contradicted my father once in 30 years of marriage." "And what would you call that?" Dr. Ward asked. Alizio looked at him. 10 seconds of silence. "Control," he said, then paused. Then added, "The same thing I did to Ellie." Dr. Ward nodded once. "And when did you realize that?" "Yesterday," Alizio said. "When she stood in the courthouse and said she was afraid of me, and she had reason to be." The first session ended after 50 minutes. Alizio left the office feeling no better. It felt as though someone had opened a door he had spent his entire life keeping shut, and behind it was a room full of things he never wanted to see. He came back the following Monday and the one after that. Each session opened another door. His father, his upbringing, the way he learned that loving someone created weakness and weakness was what enemies exploited. The way he had turned Ellie into a version of his mother without realizing it. 3 weeks after the hearing, under the supervised visitation order, Alizio met Nico for the first time. The Family Visitation Center in Midtown, the second floor of a municipal building, a small room with pale yellow walls, fluorescent lights, green carpet, plastic toys stacked in a corner, and a social worker seated at a desk taking notes. Nothing like any room Alizio had entered in the past 20 years. No leather sofas, no whiskey, no bodyguards. He arrived without a suit for the first time Tommy could remember, wearing an open-collar white shirt and dark trousers. And when Tommy asked why he wasn't wearing a suit, Alizio said, "I'm not meeting a business partner. I'm meeting my son." Ellie was already in the room when he entered. She sat on the carpet with Nico on her lap, 4 months old, dressed in a pale blue onesie, okaying around with wide, curious brown eyes. Ellie looked at Alizio and said nothing, didn't stand, didn't greet him, just watched him with guarded eyes, and he understood he had no right to expect anything else. He sat on the floor opposite her, awkward, his knees unaccustomed to bending that way, his hands unsure where to rest. And he realized that he, a man who controlled $100 million empire, didn't know how to sit on the floor with his 4-month-old son. Ellie placed Nico on the carpet between them. The baby lay on his back, kicking his legs, waving his arms, staring at the ceiling, and then turning toward Alizio. Ellie's brown eyes on a face with Alizio's nose. The baby looked at him. He looked at the baby and he didn't know what to do. He had negotiated with Colombian drug lords, stared down the FBI without blinking, made decisions that altered hundreds of lives without hesitation, but he didn't know how to touch a 4-month-old child staring up at him from a green carpet. He extended his hand slowly, his index finger toward the baby. Nico watched the finger, lifted his tiny hand, and wrapped all 5 small fingers around Alizio's index finger, gripping tight, not letting go. The baby held his father's finger with the strength of a 4-month-old, not strong, but certain. And Alizio felt that small force pull something out of him, something Dr. Ward had opened the door to, but hadn't yet drawn out. Something Alizio had buried under 20 years of coldness, control, and power. And now it came free without permission or warning because 5 tiny fingers were holding his and refusing to let go. Alizio turned his head away, his jaw tightened, his shoulders stiffened. He didn't want anyone to see. But it was too late because the tears fell before he could stop them. And this was something Alizio Ferraro didn't do. Never did. His father taught him that men don't cry. And he hadn't cried when his father died. Hadn't cried when he made the RST decision that ended a life. Hadn't cried once in 20 years. But he was crying now because a 4-month-old baby was holding his finger on a cheap green carpet under fluorescent lights. Ellie saw it. She sat less than a meter away and saw his shoulders shake. Saw him turn his face aside, saw the drop fall onto the carpet. She said nothing, no comfort, no mockery, no acknowledgement. She simply sat there in silence and allowed him that moment with his son without judgment. It was the most generous thing she could give him right now, and she knew it. And he would never know how much strength it had taken her to remain still while the man who had broken her cried in front of her. The following visits took place twice a week at the Midtown Center. The same room, the same green carpet, the same social worker seated in the corner taking notes. And Alizio arrived on time every single time, not a minute late. Something Tommy later told Ellie in private had never happened in all his years working with his boss because Alizio Ferraro made others wait and never waited for anyone. On the 3rd visit, Alizio asked to change Nico's diaper. Ellie watched him for a moment, then nodded and placed Nico on the changing mat on the carpet. Alizio knelt down, opened the old diaper, and everything after that turned into a disaster. He opened it backward. He pulled the adhesive tabs so hard they tore. He took out a clean diaper, but put it on back to front. Nico kicked nonstop and caught Alizio's hand twice. And Alizio looked at the baby with the same expression he usually reserved for stubborn negotiation opponents. He folded the diaper, taped it crookedly, loose on one side, and when he lifted Nico, the diaper slid down one of the baby's legs. Ellie watched the entire process without helping. Her lips didn't smile, but the corner of her mouth shifted slightly, just a little. And it was the first time since the hearing that something crossed her face that wasn't caution or coldness. He looked at her, looked at the crooked diaper, then said he'd learn. She said he should. Then took Nico and changed the diaper again in 15 seconds with one-handed movements. Only someone who'd changed thousands of diapers could manage. On the 5th visit, he succeeded for the first time. Not perfectly, a little tight on the left hip, but it didn't fall off. He looked at Nico in the clean diaper with an expression Tommy later said was identical to the look on his face when he closed a $50 million port deal, which meant pure satisfaction. On the 7th visit, he brought food, not from an expensive restaurant. A brown paper bag from a small deli in Hell's Kitchen. Inside it, a container of hot chicken soup. He set it on the table beside Ellie as she fed Nico a bottle and said he thought she might be hungry. The visits lasted 2 hours and she came straight from teaching. Ellie looked at the soup container, then looked at him. The deli in Hell's Kitchen. She'd mentioned it once, only once, more than 2 years earlier, on the second night they went out, when he asked what she liked to eat most, and she said chicken soup from the small deli near the bar where she worked because she used to buy a container after winter night shifts to hold on the walk home to warm her hands before eating. She'd mentioned it once more than 2 years ago. You remembered that, she said. Not a question, almost as if she were speaking to herself. I remember more than you think, Alizio said. I just didn't know how to show you. Silence. Nico finished his bottle, eyes growing heavy. Ellie didn't respond. She didn't thank him. She didn't smile. She didn't say he didn't have to do that or that it didn't change anything. She simply opened the soup, took the plastic spoon, and ate slowly, spoon by spoon. The soup was hot and salty, tasting of chicken and onion and celery, and something like the memory of winter nights, walking from the bar back to the basement studio in Queens, when she'd been free and poor and lonely, but at least lonely by choice rather than lonely by force inside a gilded cage. She finished the soup, set the empty container on the table, and that was all. No further words. But Alizio looked at the empty container and understood she'd eaten everything, and in the language the two of them had spoken far too little during a year of marriage, an empty soup container was the largest answer she could give him right now. If this story is making you feel something, press like now and share it with someone who needs to hear it. And don't forget to subscribe to the channel because Ellie and Alizio's journey isn't over yet, and you won't want to miss what happens next. Nico was 6 months old, and the small midtown hotel room where Ellie had been staying since returning to New York had become unbearable. The room was 18 square meters with a single bed, a collapsible crib, a kitchenette that was really just a microwave sitting on a cabinet, and a mini fridge tucked under the desk. Baby clothes hanging from the curtain rod because there was no dryer, toys piled into one corner, competing for space with suitcases and bags. And every time Nico started practicing rolling and trying to crawl, he hit a wall within 2 seconds because there was nowhere to crawl. Ellie knew she needed a real place to live. But Manhattan rent was something her online language teaching income couldn't touch. So she'd started looking farther out. Queens, the Bronx, even New Jersey, anywhere with rent under $1,200 a month and close to public transportation. Alizio learned about it through Tommy because Tommy knew everything. And Tommy told Alizio not to interfere, but because he'd seen the hotel room once when he came to pick Alizio up after a visit. And Tommy knew a 6-month-old baby couldn't grow up in 18 square meters. Alizio came to the next visit with a proposal. Before you say no, just hear me out. He said he owned a brownstone in Park Slope, Brooklyn legally on the books of a real estate company, not tied to anything else, and she could check. Ground floor, 3 bedrooms, a small backyard, close to good schools for when the baby got older, a safe neighborhood. She'd pay market rent, $2,800 a month, and she could call any broker to confirm that was standard for the area. Not free, no strings, no favors, but it was safe, and he was 10 minutes away if she needed anything for Nico. Ellie looked at him and every instinct in her screamed, no, no, because this was Alizio Ferraro and everything he gave came with a price. No, because the last time he gave her a home, that home came with cameras and guards and monitored credit cards. No, because she'd gone too far and endured too much to step back into any cage, no matter how beautiful it looked. But she also looked at Nico squirming on the visitation room carpet, trying to crawl, and he needed space, and he needed a yard to play in, and he needed his own room, and she couldn't let her pride or her fear decide over her child's needs. She said she'd go see it with no promises. She went to see it and hated herself for loving it immediately. The brownstone was built of warm brown stone. A short staircase leading to the front door. The ground floor opening into a spacious living room with oak floors and natural light pouring through 3 large windows. An open kitchen with a small breakfast bar. 3 bedrooms toward the back, a bathroom with a real bathtub instead of a shower that cut off after 10 minutes, and a back door that opened to a small paved yard with a wooden fence and a young maple tree. She stood in the empty living room and imagined Nico crawling across that wooden floor. Imagined him taking his first steps there. Imagined summer afternoons with him playing in the yard beneath the maple. And her throat tightened because she'd never had a home. Never. Every place she'd lived had been temporary. Foster care was temporary. The basement studio was temporary. The penthouse was a cage. Savannah was escape. The hotel was survival. And now she was standing in this apartment with Brooklyn afternoon light spilling across the floor, and she wanted to cry because she loved it and she hated that it came from him. She went back to Elizio and said yes with one condition. If he crossed any boundary at all, she'd leave immediately. No questions, no explanations, no second chances. He said, agreed. She moved in 2 weeks later. Elizio came to help. He assembled the new crib she'd bought from a second-hand baby store, reading the instruction manual with an expression Tommy secretly photographed and kept on his phone because Tommy said he'd never seen his boss frown at a piece of furniture assembly instructions. He mounted bookshelves in Nico's room, positioned the dining table exactly where Ellie pointed, and he didn't once suggest where she should put anything or how she should decorate or change a single detail. He only asked where she wanted things and did exactly that. By 6 in the evening, everything was done. Cardboard boxes were stacked in the corner of the living room. Nico slept in his new crib in his own room for the first time in his life. Late afternoon light slanted through the kitchen window. Elizio stood at the door and said he should go so she could settle in. Ellie nodded. Thank you for everything today. He smiled softly. Not the power smile or the controlling smile she'd known before. Just a smile. Then stepped out, walked down the brownstone steps, and Ellie closed the door. She stood in the middle of the living room, cardboard. Boxes, oak floors, evening light. The sound of Nico's steady breathing coming through the baby monitor, and she felt something she hadn't had a word for until now. Something foster families never gave her. Something the penthouse never gave her. Something Savannah almost gave her, but not quite. Because in Savannah, she was still running. Here, she wasn't running anymore. Here, she chose to stay. And this apartment with its wooden floors and the maple tree in the yard and the crib in her son's room. This place was home. For the first time in 27 years, home. Ellie had been living in the Brooklyn brownstone for 3 weeks when the envelope appeared. On a Saturday morning, she opened the front door to push Nico's stroller out for their usual walk and almost stepped on it. A white envelope with no name, no stamp, no return address placed directly on the brownstone step in front of her door. She picked it up, opened it, and found 2 things inside. The first was a photograph taken from a distance, probably with a telephoto lens from across the street or farther. A picture of Ellie pushing Nico's stroller along the park slope sidewalk. And she recognized the gray hoodie she'd worn the previous Wednesday, and the maple tree on the corner of 7th Avenue, which meant someone had been watching her for at least 3 days, and close enough to capture Nico's face clearly in the stroller. The second was a small card, white paper, printed letters, no signature, just 1 sentence. Cute baby. Ellie stood on the stoop, and her hands didn't shake because she'd passed the stage of shaking a long time ago. Her body had grown so used to fear that fear now lived in the background of her life. But what she felt was worse than trembling. It was anger. Deep and hot because someone had photographed her son from afar and left it at her doorstep as a message that they knew where she was and could come any time. She brought Nico inside, locked the door, and called Elizio. He arrived. Ed in 9 minutes. She knew because she checked the clock. He looked at the photo, looked at the card, and his face didn't change, but his eyes did. Something behind those gray eyes darkened, cooled, and Ellie realized she was seeing Elizio in a way she never had before. Not the clumsy father struggling with diapers and crying when his son grabbed his finger, but the head of the Ferraro family, the man people feared and the reason they feared him. Del Veo, he said, almost to himself. Franco Del Veo. He explained it to her briefly without embellishment. Del Veo was the boss of a rival family in Philadelphia, expanding into New York, clashing with Ferraro territory for 2 years now. And now he knew Elizio had a son, a newborn, a weakness, something the underworld could exploit. Ellie listened, and each word was a brick in a wall she tried to convince herself didn't exist. The wall between the normal life she wanted for Nico and the violent world Nico's father belonged to. She asked how he was going to handle it. He said he'd place people around the neighborhood discreetly. She wouldn't see them unless she looked. But it was her decision, and he wouldn't do anything without her consent. She looked at him and remembered the penthouse, the cameras, the guards, the isolation. And she knew he remembered too, because he looked at her like a man forcing himself not to repeat old mistakes. Even as his instincts screamed at him to control, surround, lock her away for safety. She agreed under 3 conditions. The guards kept their distance. She wasn't monitored. And she was told everything related to the threat. No hiding, no filtering, no deciding for her what she needed to know and what she didn't. He nodded. 3 days later, Ellie was feeding Nico his first solid food in the kitchen at 7 in the evening. Rice cereal mixed with milk that Nico spat out more than he swallowed. When Elizio knocked on the door, 9 p.m., not a visitation hour, she opened it and saw 2 things. His right hand wrapped in bandages across the knuckles, scratches along the back of his hand, and in his eyes the same darkness she'd seen when he looked at Del Veo's photo, now heavier, deeper, like someone who'd just done something light shouldn't witness. "What happened?" she asked. "It's handled," he said, his voice flat in a way she recognized from the penthouse. The voice from nights he came home at 3 in the morning with blood on his shirt. "You promised you wouldn't hide things from me." Silence. He looked at her, then said Del Veo had sent 2 men to watch her all week. His people intercepted them that night. He spoke to them directly. They wouldn't be back. And he'd sent a message to Del Veo that if anyone of his came near her or Nico again, that would be their last conversation. How? She asked, even though she already knew the answer. He didn't reply. She didn't ask more. She stood in the doorway looking at a man trying to change for his son. Knowing his scraped knuckles weren't from a fall. And that her and her child's safety that night came from violence. The same violence she'd run from. The same darkness she wanted to keep Nico away from. And now that darkness was standing at her door with injured hands, asking with his eyes if she was okay. She was okay. She wasn't okay. She was in the gray space between gratitude and revulsion, between safety and morality. And that gray space was where she'd have to live if she chose to let Elizio Ferraro stay in her son's life. She said, "Come in." Nico isn't asleep yet. He came in and sat on the kitchen floor with Nico. The baby reached out and grabbed his bandaged finger, and Elizio gently offered his other hand instead. Ellie turned to wash the dishes and didn't look back because she needed a minute not to see it, not to see father and son on the warm kitchen floor, knowing it had been paid for by something else somewhere in the dark. The following month, Regina visited for the first time. E called ahead and asked Ellie through Tommy if she could come. And the fact that Regina Ferraro asked for permission instead of declaring she was coming was the first change Ellie noticed. Regina arrived on a Sunday afternoon wearing a gray wool coat, her silver hair still pinned tight, but her face softer than the last time Ellie had seen her in the courtroom. She brought a book, Goodnight Moan, a hardcover with slightly worn corners. And when Ellie asked where she'd gotten it, Regina said it was the book she used to read to Elizio when he was little before his father forbade her from reading stories because he said fairy tales made children weak. She sat on the sofa with Nico on her lap and read in a voice Ellie had never heard from her. Soft, slow, almost gentle. And Nico looked up at her with wide brown eyes. And Regina looked back at her grandson. And Ellie saw something crack across her face. Not a smile, closer to tears. But Regina Ferraro didn't cry the way her son didn't cry. At least not before. "He's beautiful," Regina said to Ellie as she stood to leave. "You're raising him well." "Thank you." My son is lucky you're giving him this chance. Ellie looked at her and said, he's making that chance himself. Regina nodded slowly, then stepped out the door, and on the brownstone stoop, she paused for a second, looking at the quiet park slope street on a Sunday afternoon with its maple tree and brick sidewalks and sunlight filtering through leaves. And Ellie thought maybe Regina was looking at something she'd never had for herself. A normal home on a normal street where her grandson would grow up, not in a graystone Long Island mansion with lessons about emotion being weakness, but here with oak floors and goodnight moon and a mother who read to him every night. And maybe that realization was both a relief and a kind of grief for everything she'd never given her own son. Nico turned 1 on a Saturday in June, and Ellie held his birthday party in the backyard of the Park Slope brownstone. Not a big party, not a Ferraro-style event with champagne and hotel ballrooms, just a small paved yard with a maple tree that had grown taller since she moved in. A wooden table covered with a white cloth, blue paper plates, and a small one-tier cake she baked herself at 5 in the morning while Nico was still asleep. The frosting uneven because she'd never been good at decorating cakes. But she wrote Nico's name in blue icing, the end slightly slanted and the O a little crooked, and she thought it was perfect. The guest list was short. Dr. Calloway flew in from Savannah because she said she wouldn't miss the first birthday of the baby she'd emotionally delivered for 6 months, even if she hadn't been the actual obstetrician. Charles Whitfield came with his wife and brought a stuffed bear bigger than Nico. Tommy came wearing jeans instead of a suit for the first time, and he looked like a completely different person. Regina came carrying a new book, Pat the Bunny, hardcover, and a small silver bracelet engraved with Nico's name, which she said was a Ferraro family tradition for a child's first birthday. And when she said it, she looked at Ellie instead of Alizio, as if asking permission, and Ellie nodded. Alizio arrived last. White shirt with the sleeves rolled up, dark pants, no suit, no guards entering the yard. And as he stepped through the back door, Nico was sitting on the picnic blanket under the maple tree. Saw him, lifted both arms, both of them, and made a sound Ellie had been trying to teach him for 2 weeks. Baba. Not very clear, almost Baba, but clear enough for Alizio to stop in the middle of the yard and stand there for 3 seconds before lifting his son, and Ellie saw his jaw tighten in the way she'd learned, meant he was trying not to let emotion show, and not succeeding very well. The afternoon passed slowly and warmly. Nico grabbed cake with both hands and smeared more on his face than into his mouth. Regina held her grandson for the first time without being asked and sang a lullaby in Italian that Alizio said he'd never heard her sing before. Then she looked at him and said softly that she used to sing to him every night until his father forbade it because he said fairy tales made children weak. Alizio didn't reply. Tommy took photos with his phone, many of them. Nico smiling, Nico covered in frosting. Regina holding Nico, Ellie cutting the cake, and one photo Tommy later said was the most important he'd ever taken. Alizio sitting on the back steps watching Ellie wipe Nico's face with a wet cloth while Nico laughed. Afternoon sunlight falling on their hair, and Alizio looking at them with an expression Tommy had never seen on his boss in 12 years. The look of a man who knew he'd nearly lost everything and was trying with everything he had to deserve what he was lucky enough to still hold. Guests left at 7. Regina hugged Ellie before leaving. Short and stiff because she wasn't used to hugging people, but she hugged her and Ellie hugged back. Tommy shook Alizio's hand and said quietly that he was doing great. Boss. Ellie bathed Nico, put him in pajamas, fed him a bottle, and Nico fell asleep at 8 in his crib. She walked into the living room, and Alizio was still on the sofa, 2 cups of tea on the table, which he'd made while she bathed Nico. And she realized he hadn't asked if he could stay. He just made tea and waited. And if she told him to leave, he would. She didn't tell him to leave. She sat at the other end of the sofa, picked up her cup, and they sat in silence, listening to crickets in the backyard, the occasional car passing on the street, and Nico's steady breathing through the baby monitor on the coffee table. Best year of my life, Alizio said, not looking at her, looking at the tea. Not the easiest year, but the best. Because I have my son and because for the first time I'm starting to understand how wrong I lived for so man. Why years? Silence. Ellie sipped her tea and didn't answer. He didn't need her to. He needed to speak, and she gave him space the same way she'd given him space to cry in the visitation room 4 months earlier. And that quiet generosity was something Elizio knew he'd never fully deserve but would never stop trying to earn. At 2 a.m, Nico cried. Ellie opened her eyes on the sofa, not sure when she'd fallen asleep. A thin blanket over her that she didn't remember taking. And she heard Nico crying through the monitor. But before she could stand, she heard something else. Elizio's voice from Nico's room. Low, soft, not really singing, more like humming, steady, and gentle. And Nico's cries faded and stopped. She stood at the nursery door and looked in. The soft yellow nightlight illuminated them. Elizio stood by the crib with Nico in his arms, the baby's head resting on his shoulder. And Elizio rocked him gently, not skillfully, slightly off rhythm, but Nico was asleep again, and Elizio kept rocking because he didn't want to stop. She went back to the sofa without letting him know she'd seen. The next morning, sunlight flooded the kitchen. Elizio made coffee, 2 cups, exactly how she drank it. Little sugar, lots of milk. And she remembered that he remembered that, just like he remembered the chicken soup. Just like he remembered more than she thought. They sat at the kitchen table in silence. Hot coffee. The quietest morning she'd ever had with him. Then Elizio set his cup down and said, Ellie, I think we should stop pretending this is just co-parenting. Silence. She looked at him. He looked at her. Not the cold, gray eyes of the penthouse. Not the dark eyes of the night he came home with scraped hands. The eyes of a man who'd sat across from Dr. Ward every week for 4 months, changed hundreds of diapers, learned how to sit on the floor, read Goodnight Moon every Wednesday night during visits, made her coffee the right way, remembered chicken soup, cried because 5 tiny fingers wrapped around his own. I haven't forgiven you, Ellie said. Not completely. Maybe never completely. He nodded. Didn't ask for more. Didn't demand. Didn't say but someday. Just nodded and waited. But I see you trying, she said. And you try every day, and that matters. That's enough for now. Small feet kicked against crib rails through the monitor. Nico was awake. They both stood at the same time, walked into the nursery together, and Nico lay in the crib, eyes open, looking up, looking at his mother, looking at his father, and he smiled. A smile that knew nothing of penthouses or courtrooms or threatening envelopes or Katerina's laughter behind closed doors or a wedding ring left alone on a kitchen counter or a 14-hour Greyhound ride or a Queen's pharmacy bathroom or 7 foster families or any of the darkness his parents had survived. A smile that only knew morning had come and Mom was here and Dad was here and the world was good. Ellie looked at Elizio. Elizio looked at Ellie, and for the first time they didn't need to say anything. The story of Ellie and Elizio teaches us that forgiveness isn't forgetting. Forgiveness is seeing someone trying to change and giving them space to prove it through actions, not words. It also reminds us that true strength doesn't come from power or money. It comes from daring to walk away when you must and daring to stay when you should. And above all, real love isn't possession. It's respect. It's listening. It's letting the other person be who they are. If this story touched your heart, please like and share this video with someone you love so we can spread these values together. Please subscribe to our channel so you don't miss the next stories. We'd truly love to hear how this story made you feel, what you saw in Ellie or Elizio that reflected your own life. So, please share your thoughts in the comments below. Thank you sincerely for staying with us until the very end. We wish everyone watching good health, a joyful life, and peace and happiness every day. Goodbye, and we'll see you in the next video.